Welcome to my presentation on Howard Hughes based off of the movie The Aviator. So, looking at Howard as though he was a client and taking the perspective of him being referred to me from a supportive friend is more of the way that I viewed this situation. So, to begin, just to describe some of the background on Howard, he is described to be in his mid 50s. He, for the majority of his life, had really been focused on his career. He is an excellent engineer involved in aerospace and has also more recently, gotten into filmmaking. In addition to that, he did have a fiance at the time. However, as his symptoms of his disorder started to increase, this kind of started to cause some problems in their relationship, and eventually the relationship did not last. More recently, he has been experiencing a lot of symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder. This has transitioned throughout his mid 20s to his current state right now, which is what I'm describing as mid 50s. It has escalated from experiencing more mild symptoms of repeating phrases, noticing a crumb on a gentleman's shirt and asking him to remove it, to now being a full escalation and what I would consider a more severe end of the spectrum, being that he has locked himself in a theater room for what appears to be weeks, maybe months at a time. He was not clothed during this time, was not showering, was barely eating, allowed his physical appearance to become very unruly, such as not shaving, not attending to physical hygiene in any way. And so at this point, he has been referred to me, and is still having problems with leaving the theater room. He did recently leave the room to try to handle a lawsuit type of allegation, just to surmise. So he is capable of leaving. However, this was an extremely distressing situation for him. He does have a couple individuals in his support system, being the on again, off again girlfriend that he has, and the advisor to his business, which he also views as a close friend of his. Aside from that, he doesn't have any contact with his family. Both of his parents have passed away when he was in his late teen years. So, to begin, um, I diagnosed him with obsessive compulsive disorder. So, the main components of this disorder and how he meets them are as follows. The obsessions are described as unwanted and intrusive, recurrent, and distressing thoughts. So, as mentioned, he has a lot of intrusive obsessions about contamination. The 99% of his obsessive thoughts are related to this. This is seen in one of the clips that was provided, such as a man was leaving the dinner table and he shook his hand goodbye. And if you pay attention to the hand that he shook, it's very easy to see that he was shaking his hand. And then right before he left the table, his demeanor changed. He was much more aggressive and abrupt, and he was clenching his fist and slightly shaking it as he was walking away, storming into the bathroom. And this led to him acting out one of his compulsions of very being forced in his mind to start to obsessively wash his hands to the point of causing them to bleed. He adjusted his shirt, and then this led him to start to try and wash his shirt in the bathroom, and this just kept escalating. An example of how he attempted to suppress his obsessions is at a couple points pictured in the clips provided. He tries to slam his hand over his face in what appears to be a very distressing and emotionally troubling situation for him. It looks as though he really recognizes that he's struggling with something and that it's causing him a lot of internal anxiety and distress and overall pain. And he's trying to stop it, but he feels as though he is losing control of that. And he also does follow some rituals. More recently, in when he was locked in his theater room, he was looking at a milk jug and saying that it might be sour. And then he would say, I should not, etc., etc. And he went into the strict rules of how he should not open the milk jug with this certain hand, approach it from this certain angle. And he repeated this ritual verbally while acting it out for what appears to be over a few hours of time. Multiple time has passed, and he continued to keep verbalizing this ritual. To describe his compulsions, it's defined as meeting the requirement of repetitive behaviors and mental acts, and this must be in response to obsession and the rules. And so, a clear example to show that this is in response to his obsessions is that in the scene that you would see that will be posted, when he's talking about blueprints, what was not posted just for sake of time is that there was a gentleman who was a janitor. He's elderly and he had very aged fingernails, meaning that they looked very yellow, older, and so Howard became very fixated on that. He was unable to really focus on the conversation. And within a couple minutes after being fixated and repeatedly glaring at the nails and at the gentleman, he asked the other man if he could fire him. He doesn't want him to spread diseases to the company and so forth. And then shortly after that, you see he starts to repeat, show me the blueprints over and over again. And as prior mentioned, when he was touching the gentleman's hand at the dinner table, that resulted in him feeling the need to wash his hands. A different example is also when he would be eating food. Somebody intentionally took a piece of food off of his plate, and Howard immediately dropped his silverware. He became very annoyed and appeared very distressed, and he just stopped eating his meal and walked away and just left the dinner table. And also, at an aim to prevent or reduce his distress, it does look as though, and as it would be described, it looks as though all of these things that he's doing causes immense, when he's doing them, he looks very distressed. So it looks as though he is doing these acts in an attempt to stop what he's feeling. And so, such as counting the milk jugs that he is having, it looks as though he doesn't want to drink this, in his mind, sour milk. And so, in his way of dealing with that, he verbalizes how he should not do it. For time consuming, it is longer than 1 hour per day. As mentioned, it lasted more recently to weeks, possibly months, of being isolated. And only very recently, he somehow was able to navigate into his own home. However, when he was home, he spent multiple hours over a long stretch of time placing masking tape to lock off all areas of his room. And when the on again, off again woman that attempted to come over to help him came over, he had grabbed her handkerchief. He grabbed her purse with his handkerchief. He wouldn't really look at her until he removed that item that he thought was dirty. And when she went to go walk into another area of his house, he screamed at her, saying, "No, you can't go in there because that's the germ. You're in the germ-free zone right now." And the appearance on his face was very concrete, and it looked as though he fully believed everything that he was saying. And branching off of this, it did impair his social, occupational, and other important areas of his functioning. So when he more recently was very isolated from society, individuals tried to come to meet with him. One of them was his ex-fiance. The other one was a business type of enemy, per se. It was his rival, and the meeting was a very important meeting, and Howard still could not, even though he was very career driven, he still couldn't bring himself to open the door. He refused to have any face-to-face conversation for many weeks at a time, and he also refused to work on his business. and that being he had $1 million contracts with the United States Air Force to create planes that could be more efficient for how they are used in World War II at the time. And so, despite all the controversy and backlash of taking months and I believe even over a year to make real progress on this, he still continued to exile himself. And even though the company, which he is very loyal to and very career driven as a person in whole, even as the stock started to drop to very, very minimal, he still couldn't bring himself to leave that isolation. And so, just to continue, the substances and medication for this disorder to be in full, to meet full criteria, they can't be, this can't be a real explanation for his symptoms. And so, according to I have been, um, what I've been exposed to in regards to Howard, it appears as though there is no real physiological effects of these, and that the usage that he had of substances was primarily in his 20s and younger, mid to younger 20s. And at this point, it's not concretely stated whether or not this is an attributing factor. In my uh, clinical perspective, it looks as though it's not as contributing. He hasn't used substances in what I'm aware of in the last 15 to 20 years. For another mental disorder, after looking through similar disorders such as obsessive compulsive personality disorder, I've made the decision to focus more on just obsessive compulsive disorder, primarily ruling the other ones out because he is very aware of the distress that is being caused. He knows that what he's experiencing is different. In one moment that I became aware of, he was speaking with the on again, off again girlfriend, and he was very fixated on the water. And he was nervous about the germs in there. He said, "Does that water look dirty to you?" And he became very fixated on it for a moment, and then he looked at her in immense pain in his face, and he said, "I see things." And this showed that he is aware, and that's what really defined this disorder as being different from obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and that's what initially made my final decision on focusing on this disorder. And for the specifier, I chose to go with absent insight slash delusional beliefs. This is more from as his disorder progressed, it's very clear to see that it was less severe to being more absent insight delusional belief specifier, because he currently extremely believes his rituals, such as counting the milk jugs and the steps to open it for many weeks on end, saying, "Oh, what if that milk is sour?" and then definitively believing his belief. And then he continued to believe his obsession of contamination by isolating himself for weeks to months on end. And even though he wanted to have social interaction, as you could see in his face, he believed his obsession too much to the point where he couldn't bring himself to break that. And then also believing his compulsions, he believed that they would alleviate his distress by, he would continuously spell out the word quarantine, and it looked as though he was trying to do that to alleviate the pain that he was feeling from all of it, and from just trying to use that method to alleviate his feelings, his emotions in regards to his obsessions. So, moving on to treatment, I focused on what I believe would best be described as cognitive behavioral therapy, and the text had described ERP and cognitive therapy as just variations of cognitive behavioral therapy. So, this being exposure and response prevention and cognitive therapy. And so, I will just read the aims and then more of surmise the objectives, and I have some worksheets just to show you for the techniques. And so Howard will resist compulsive behaviors when in anxiety provoking situations to improve happiness and quality of life. And so this is mainly just to target the main behavior, being that he needs to stop his compulsive behaviors and be able to have a better overall quality of life. And so the second being Howard will recognize and dispute his intrusive thoughts about contamination to reduce feelings of distress and anxiety. So, really, to target the first aim, this also needs to be targeted. He needs to learn to believe in what I would be trying to teach him, being he needs to believe that his intrusive thoughts are wrong. And in order to do that, he needs to uh, go through with the following objectives. And so, to surmise, I'm really just describing that Howard will identify his thoughts and situations and behaviors that lead to his compulsive behaviors and have a more raised awareness to his what is least provoking and most provoking on an anxiety hierarchy scale. And he will also fill out thought records, and he'll learn to dispute his irrational beliefs. And all of these will be done through at least 3 to 5 times, as each objective varies, but they're usually around 3 to 5 times per week. And he'll document them, how many times he completed them, how long it took to complete some of them, and some of the more thought related ones, he'll also document his emotions around what had happened. And so, to go into the interventions and the specific techniques, the ABC model that I had in mind was to look at this one to describe the situation, such as if he's in his theater room and he's looking at the milk jug, the situation would be to look at the milk jug, his core belief being that he believes that it's sour, and then going into his thoughts, behaviors, sensations, and emotions. So, looking at the consequence of his belief. And so, this being, what does he think about it? How does he act in response to his belief, and so forth. And then to target the anxiety hierarchy, I wanted to use this exposure hierarchy sheet. There's a very excellent one provided in the textbook that actually does describe a contamination example. And this is looking at anxiety, obsession, and compulsion triggers, and it would have him label the distress levels. And this is the sheet that we could do together. And then at home for practice, he would choose the least stressful and anxiety provoking one, describe his situation to practice, and he would record how difficult he felt it was, the days that he did it. I believe I had stated he would do it at least 5 times per week. And then he would mention any notes about how the process went and so forth. And also, I would make a note at the top to have it be at least for 10 seconds at a time, as I had originally described. And then next, he would work on a thought log. So I felt that this was a great example worksheet for that. It does give a good example, and really, this is more to raise awareness to the thoughts before we begin to even tackle trying to dispute them. It would be best to teach him how to just acknowledge them in a more clear sense. And so he would fill all of these sections out and then to his best ability, and then we would discuss them together. And then lastly, taking it a step further from the thought logs, he would discuss a what if worksheet, or he would discuss them in a what if worksheet, being that he could describe a positive and a negative. And I had stated that this worksheet says 3 classes or 3 examples for each. I didn't put a specific number, but I did specify that as many negative what ifs as he has, he must have the equal number of positives. So, milk jug example again would look at what if that milk is sour. It could be as simple as what if it's not, what if it makes me sick, what if I just feel full, something simple like that, just to get him to start to consider or even say the opposite of his intrusive thought. And so overall, those are really my main treatment ideas that I have, and I would definitely be open to any better ones. It's definitely still a learning curve, and so to wrap everything up, the main support services that I feel would be best to address before a couple of them, even before beginning the treatment, is referral to a psychiatrist for medication. There's a lot of research, as mentioned in the text, that the medication combination with therapy is very effective, and physical evaluation with the physician, because there are times when he washes his hands to the point of them bleeding. I would want to have him evaluated for dermatitis, as well as to see how his body is. He spent many weeks and months isolating himself, not showering, and not taking care of his physical hygiene. So I would want to make sure that that is a primary concern. That's a primary concern that I would want to address. And then later on, I would want to, or also at the same time, I'd want to provide psychoeducation to the couple of friends that are in his support system. From the interactions that I've heard of as to how they interact between each other, it looks as though they are understanding, but they just don't really know about how to work with him and how to help him. And it sounds as though they genuinely do want to help the couple of people that are in his circle. And then lastly, this is more of an idea for once he does start to make progress, because obviously, as mentioned, he is very, very concerned with contamination. So I feel that group therapy right now might not be the best choice, because he may be too nervous about sitting in another seat somebody sat in. Something as simple as that, that you or I may not think of. I feel that that may be too overwhelming at first for him, especially if somebody tries to go shake his hand in a group meeting or whatnot. And so those are the main therapeutic support services. And thank you for listening to my presentation.